It is my cat. Hi everyone, welcome to class. So today we're going to really begin our delving into the history of Western philosophy. And there's no better place for us to start than the time period that we refer to as ancient philosophy. Now, ancient philosophy can cover a wide number of countries, it can cover a wide number of years. It pretty much qualifies anything that happens before the medieval period. In most of your introductory to philosophy classes, though, you're probably going to spend your time studying ancient philosophy in ancient Greece. You're going to learn about a group of individuals known as the pre-Socratics. These were philosophers who existed before and kind of during the time of Socrates. And while they are very prominent and well-known figures, people like Thales and Zeno, we don't spend a lot of time studying them in our traditional introductory to philosophy courses. You really learn about them more in an ancient philosophy class. So we'll have another video about the pre-Socratics at another time. Instead, we're going to spend the next few videos talking about kind of the three big pillars of Western ancient philosophy: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Now, in this video specifically, we're going to talk about the first person that I mentioned there, Socrates. Socrates is considered by many to be the father of Western philosophy. Now, the reason for this is because he, of course, gives us what is known as the Socratic method, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in this video. And he was the teacher of Plato, who in turn was the teacher of Aristotle. And considering that all three of these figures were so influential, it kind of makes sense that anytime we start talking about, well, where does Western philosophy really begin, we tend to always pick Socrates. Now, another reason why Socrates is considered to be the father of Western philosophy, and why he's always a good foothold for us to begin, a good foundation to start at, is because Socrates was practicing philosophy during a time in which humanity was switching from being prominently an oral culture to a literate culture. Now, if you don't know what this means, don't worry, we're going to go ahead and explain that. To be an oral culture is essentially to do what I keep messing up at in these videos: talking. An oral culture is one that communicates through the spoken word. It communicates education and knowledge and learning through speaking. You want to learn about the history of your family, about the history of your culture, about the history of your civilization, you have to talk to someone in an oral culture. It's sitting around the campfire, spreading tales about legends and fables and history. It's talking to your best friends and your family and your peers about the way that the world works and questioning these things through communication. A literate culture is one that writes things down. We currently in history are a literate culture. We write everything down. In fact, in our digital age, we tend to write things down not just physically, but now digitally. And that's a communication for a whole nother time and a whole nother topic of a whole nother video. But during ancient philosophy, being a literate culture was beginning to write down knowledge. You had ideas about things, you would write it down. We could write down stories and legends and fables, and they were no longer something passed around the campfire as much, but instead were compiled in books or tomes or on scrolls. Oral culture was still a very big prominent part in the ancient world because, of course, not everybody could read and not everybody could write. But this shift from a prominence of oral communication to literate communication is such a tonal and cultural shift that it really is marked here in history. So Socrates himself kind of found himself at the forefront of this shift, which is ironic because Socrates never actually wrote anything down himself. Socrates was a very big practitioner and lover of the oral culture. He never actually wrote anything down. In fact, everything we know about Socrates never actually comes from writings he himself did. Everything we know about Socrates comes from one of two places. The primary place that we learn about Socrates is from what are known as the Platonic dialogues. These are dialogues written by his student Plato. Everything else we know about Socrates comes from first or second-hand writings from other philosophers or academics of the time, either mentioning him in a story or in passing or through some form of communication. So really the majority of what we know about Socrates and who he was as a person, who he was as a philosopher, comes to us from second or third-hand parties. They're not from Socrates himself. Now this becomes a little bit of a funny irony because, well, Socrates, as we'll learn today, told us to question everything. And the man who told us to question everything, his own existence kind of gets called into question. We'd suspect, that more than likely Socrates existed, but there is still a little bit of an asterisk next to that, a little bit of a question mark, because we don't have any actual first-hand accounts of Socrates' existence. Everything we know about the man, well, it comes to us from other people. Why then do we care so much about Socrates? Yeah, he's found in this oral and literate tonal cultural shift. And yeah, he was the teacher of Plato, who was in turn the teacher of Aristotle. And Those are very famous names. But why do we care about Socrates? What did Socrates himself teach us? In fact, some of you probably know that, there's a saying that one of the biggest tragedies in academia, one of the biggest tragedies in philosophy is the death of Socrates. Why do we care? He's such a prominent figure that he's featured in popular culture in films like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. You can find him wandering around Athens and doing quests for him in Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Why does Socrates make what one of my professors called the cultural cut? Why does he persist? Why does he last? How and why did he make the cut of historical culture? Well, to really understand Socrates and his legacy, we kind of have to start with a very particular story. This is the story of when Socrates went and talked to a particular oracle, the Oracle of Delphi. Now, some people say Delphi, and I'm honestly not quite sure of the correct way to say it, but for the sake of this video and my lesson, we're going to go ahead and just keep saying Delphi, and I apologize if that bothers you. The Oracle of Delphi and Socrates had a communication, and the story goes that when he went to visit the Oracle of Delphi, the Oracle, being one of the most respected voices in Greece and in Athens, told him that he was the wisest man alive. Now, if you know a little bit about Socrates, you know a number of things. You don't have to know a lot to know these things about him. You know that he's, 1, an asshole, 2, he's arrogant, he didn't bathe, he was a kind of a bad father, and he was a jerk. And I know I said he was an asshole and a jerk in the same time, but that's how arrogant he was. Socrates was kind of a really big jerk. And so when the oracle told him that he was the wisest man alive, a statement that he did not agree with, Socrates essentially called bullshit. He was like, no, hold on. There is no way that I am the wisest man alive. There's a lot of stuff that I just don't know, that I have no experience in, or very little experience in. There are people out there who know far more than I do, because they're well versed, they're well learned, they're experts in these things. So Oracle, how is it that you could ever call me the wisest man alive? And so Socrates decided that he was going to prove the Oracle wrong. He was that stubborn and arrogant. He wanted to prove one of the most respected people in ancient Greece at the time wrong in her proclamation that Socrates was the wisest. And so this is what he did. He went around and questioned everyone. Anyone and everyone who claimed to know anything, he questioned. If you said you were an expert in something, if you had experience in something, he questioned you. He asked you things he wanted to know to prove to the oracle that there were people who in fact knew more than he did. And in doing this, he created what was known as the Socratic method. Now, the Socratic method of philosophy is one of his biggest legacies, and you've probably heard of it before. So what is the Socratic method? The Socratic method is essentially a critical thinking tool. It's using dialogue and discourse to get to the root of certain problems and certain avenues of logic. You essentially have a communication, a dialogue with somebody, a conversation of one-on-one to get to the root of their ideas. It's a yes-no back and forth. So if we were practicing the Socratic method, for example, I would ask you some questions and you would give me your responses on what you thought of those questions, and I would respond to what you said, and then you would respond to my said. It's just a conversation. But it's a conversational tool that is used in such a way, it essentially allows us to critically think together in an oral communication type of way. It allows for us to get to the root problems, or to the roots of certain logical conundrums, just through communication and logic. The Socratic method is still used in literal culture. It's what happens when you write a persuasive or research essay. You essentially provide premises and reach a conclusion, and now people read your paper and then offer their rebuttals to you, and you then respond to their rebuttals to your paper, and they respond to your rebuttals or your solutions, and so on and so forth. The Socratic method is still used, and in some cases it's still used in debate, in this conversational discourse that we can have. But in other avenues, it is used online when we post something and we respond through comments. It's used in papers, as I already said, when we write papers and somebody writes an editorial about your paper or a response, why they have problems with it, and you respond to their problems trying to fix it. It goes back and forth. Now, Socrates did this to a number of people at Athens, all across Athens. Like I said, if you were an expert, the man wanted to talk to you. And more often than not, these dialogues that Socrates had ended with the other person getting frustrated and angry and kind of going, well, you know what, Socrates, I don't have time for this. I've got to leave. I've got to go. You're driving me crazy, or I don't have the answer for you right now, but we'll pick this up later at another time. The reason why it always came to this was Socrates would ask the expert questions, typically kind of yes-no questions, And the person would say, well, yes, that's obviously how it is. And they'd give him a definition. And Socrates would take this definition and now phrase an entire argument around it. And he'd begin putting out premises built around this definition that this person gave him and kind of showing the logical absurdities in that definition. And the person would respond, kind of trying to clarify themselves. And what they ended up doing was just beginning to dig themselves a bigger and bigger hole. They just kind of created more definitions, and they'd have to backtrack on certain ones and change it, and Socrates would go, but you just said this, so how can it now be that? You just said that the sky is blue, so why is it that you can say that now sometimes the sky is gray? Or you said that, sometimes 2 + 2 equals 4, but other times it doesn't, and he would get you to kind of contradict yourself. And this pissed off a lot of people. If you've never read a Platonic dialogue, this is essentially what you see. In one of our later videos, we're going to go over a dialogue of pretty big renown known as the Euthyphro. And that's a pretty good introduction to kind of the Socratic method if you've never looked at it before. So stay tuned for that. We're going to look at the Euthyphro and kind of examine how the Socratic method goes down through the Euthyphro. But Socrates did this to a number of people in Athens, and it really pissed off a lot of people. And so in doing this, Socrates did ultimately come to a conclusion. He came to the conclusion that he might in fact be the wisest man alive. Maybe the oracle was right. But the reason she was right was not for the reasons he originally thought. Socrates thought that being the wisest man alive meant knowing everything, being the smartest man alive. At least that's what he thought when the oracle proclaimed him such. After examining many of Athens' experts through this Socratic method and through these dialogues, Socrates came to a new realization, a new conclusion, that in fact he was the wisest man alive not because he claimed to know everything, but in fact because he claimed to know nothing. And so this is where we kind of get Socrates' famous proclamation, I know nothing. Socrates was then a man who went around claiming that he knew nothing, and it wasn't that he literally had no beliefs or no ideas. No, he had beliefs and he had ideas. He believed that he knew things personally, but he never claimed to know things with certainty. And so this proclamation of not knowing anything, that to be the wisest person is to not know anything with certainty, to have a little bit of skepticism, is what ultimately leads to the foundation of a lot of philosophical belief and practice. It's this idea that you can't claim to know anything with certainty, because if you know something with certainty, you dig yourself into a hole. Don't misinterpret this in the modern way of, claiming things about science or the scientific practices. We understand that, yes, gravity, taking my hair tie, gravity does exist. We claim, yes, gravity exists. We can see this. We accept this as a personal belief. Gravity is a thing, is a law of nature. But this claim that Socrates makes, actually, you can find it at the foundations of scientific thought and inquiry itself. Science doesn't just go, cool, we've discovered the atom. That's it. It's the atom. Because, fun fact, the reason why we named the atom is because the word atom in Greek means not cuttable. It's uncuttable. So when we found the atom, we thought it was the smallest piece of matter to exist. It was the smallest we could go. Now we have subatomic particles, and we have things smaller than that. It's this realization that, holy crap, we thought something, we believed it, but we continue to question it and go, well, yes, we believe that the atom is the smallest thing, but is it really? Could we still cut it? What would happen if we could? We ponder and we question and we continue to experiment and explore. And so this was at the root of Socrates' belief. This was at the root of philosophy, and it still continues to be at the root today of philosophy and even the scientific practices. To claim I know nothing doesn't mean that we can never know anything with certainty, or that you can't hold personal beliefs or values. You 1000% can hold beliefs and can hold values. But the claim I know nothing is the philosophical idea that we should still continue to question those beliefs. We should always continue to question the things that we hold truest and dearest to ourselves. And so in my philosophy classes, when I teach philosophy, I like to tell my students that you should always question your own beliefs, and that it's always the purpose of my classes not to attack your beliefs, but to just ask you personally to question them yourselves. Because I've always felt that it's dangerous to hold a belief if you've never questioned it, if you've never tried to see the other side or to listen to the arguments around it. Because by listening to the other side or by looking at the arguments that are around your beliefs, you can either figure out that maybe it's not what you actually believe, or maybe You actually do believe it, but now you're better equipped to defend it. And so, in questioning things like gravity, in questioning subatomic particles, in questioning ethics and metaphysics, we question, what it is to be human. But we question our own beliefs, and we continue to push ourselves forward. We push humanity forward by always questioning and looking to solve these questions through reason and logic. And that is the heart of philosophy, and that is one of the biggest aspects of Socrates' legacy. He went on to instill in us this idea that we should always question our beliefs. And this becomes extremely evident in Socrates' trial. Because when going around questioning philosophy, questioning everyone who was an expert in things around Athens, he pissed off a lot of people. And one of the individuals he pissed off was a man named Meletus, among many others, but Meletus really led this charge. Because, fun fact, when you question the people in power, you call them idiots and you tell them that they don't know things, what's likely to happen? They're gonna try to get rid of you. And that's exactly what happened here with Socrates. So Meletus and others brought Socrates to trial on two very specific charges. The first one was not believing in the gods. Now we'll talk about that later in the Euthyphro video. But the other charge that they had for him was what we call corruption of the youth. Now in Athens, corruption of the youth was essentially equatable to treason. You could be tried and convicted and then executed if found guilty of this idea that you were corrupting the youth. Because the idea was that you weren't corrupting children. You weren't going like around to playgrounds and being like, hey kid, you want some knowledge? You want to read a book? You want to learn something? No, that's not what was happening. Socrates didn't do that. When he was corrupting the youth, quote unquote corrupting the youth, he was talking to people in their late teens, in their 20s, the young adults of the society, the people who were going to take over when the people in power passed away. In corrupting the youth, the idea was that you were corrupting the foundations of Athens. You were teaching false or bad knowledge that would lead to the ruin of Athens. Now, Socrates didn't believe this. In fact, what Socrates believed he was doing was he was teaching the youth to question. And this is actually what he talks about in the Phaedo, which is the Platonic dialogue that describes Socrates' court case. In the Phaedo, Socrates describes why he was teaching people to question, what the purpose of it was. And simply put, he was teaching people to question so that they would think for themselves. Because somebody who's willing to learn and think for themselves and to question their beliefs and really know what it is that they actually believe is far more equipped and better to lead Athens than, say, somebody who only followed, who was a yes man their entire life. He gives the example in the dialogue, actually, of a horse trainer. You know, let's say that you had to ride a horse to your destination. You had to go from, where you live to the city over. You know, you had to go over to the next town, and you had to take a horse to get there. Whose horse would you rather ride to go from your hometown to the city across the way? Would you rather ride Steve's horse? Steve has been training horses his entire life. He's been doing it for 30 years. He knows the ins and outs. He's had failings and successes. He knows how to train horses. Or would you rather ride Phil's horse? Phil has never trained a horse in his life. He's never done it, but he's got a horse for you. And he's seen people train horses his whole life. You know, he's seen people do it. And he's talked to people who've done it, and he thinks he can really do it. Whose horse would you feel safest riding? Probably Steve's horse. The person who's questioned and practiced and practiced and practiced. Phil's horse is dangerous. He has no experience. And this is what Socrates said he was doing when he was teaching the youth of Athens. He was teaching them to think for themselves. He was teaching them to think logically, to think rationally, to know what it is that they believed, and to have good moral compasses that they themselves can use when it comes time for them to lead the city. Because a person who is only taught to follow, a person who is only taught to observe and never to experience it themselves, isn't equipped to run a city. This was at the heart of Socrates' experience. And, it makes a lot of sense. And we can still see this to this day, how this makes a lot of sense. This idea that you should always question, because by experiencing, by practicing, by knowing what it is that you believe, you are a better equipped human being to go out into the world and to experience things anew. That's how you become a quote-unquote expert in something. You have to practice. You have to question. And so Socrates' adage that I know nothing just comes from the idea, the reinforcement, that we need to continue to question, even if we have experience. Even if we are Steve, who has trained a horse for dozens of years. Steve should still question his technique. Steve should still question new information and knowledge when it comes out and put it against his old knowledge and see which one wins. And if the new knowledge wins, then Steve should be willing to admit that he was wrong in his old dogmatic beliefs and adapt the new knowledge so that he can train horses better and more safely. Because really, the idea of I know nothing is to say that it's dangerous to believe dogmatic truths and principles, old truths and principles, without testing them for yourself. You have to be willing to do so. And so Socrates was very convincing in his trial. In fact, he was almost not convicted. He was, but he was almost not convicted. It was like a 51-49 split. Like, it was really close. When asked why he would do this, because they gave him an out. They said, if you stop doing it, we'll let you go. And Socrates said no. Socrates argued that the unexamined life was a life not worth living. A life in which we do not question things, a life in which we do not go forward and try to discover new ideas, a life in which we just follow blindly and don't think for ourselves is not a life worth living. To live a good human life, we need to question and examine, come to new truths, come to new principles, to never be satisfied with where we are, to never be satisfied with dogmatic traditions or beliefs, but instead to question and push humanity forward through new logic and experimentation. And so this is the legacy of Socrates. This idea, this desire, this push to question and to learn. Now, Socrates, as I said, was convicted and he was sentenced to death. And he was killed through poison. He drank poison and died from that, a poison known as hemlock. Now, in another video, we'll examine the reading of Socrates' death. But for now, I just want to leave you with that. You know, we needed to ask the question of who is Socrates and why is he so important to philosophy? Well, the simple answer is he's a foundational principle in it. The idea of I know nothing, the idea of the unexamined life not being worth living, that we should question everything and never take anything, any knowledge for granted, any belief for granted, is really what's at the bottom foundation, the heart of not just philosophy, but the sciences as well, of education. And so that's why we still to this day continue to talk about Socrates. And there are many Platonic dialogues you can read to brush yourself up on Socrates' personal beliefs, but you do have to be a little bit careful because some of the Platonic dialogues, while written and we believe to be Socrates' own beliefs and ideas, some of them we think were just Plato using Socrates as a mouthpiece. The Republic, for example, is a wonderful example of that. And we'll actually look at that in the next video when we talk about what is known as the allegory of the cave. Well, thank you all so much for coming to class today. I really appreciate it, and I hope you learned something about Socrates and where the Western tradition of philosophy began. And I pose this question to you. Have you been living an examined or unexamined life? Have you questioned your beliefs or the beliefs of your society or how you were grown up, or have you simply just kind of run the course? Because honestly, it's never too late to begin questioning. It's never too late to begin examining your own life and examining your own beliefs. It's never too late to change them or to reinforce them through examination. So I leave you with that. Ponder on that, think about it, and live life examined. Thanks for coming in, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.